Welcome to the At Sea Podcast. I'm your host, Justin McRoberts. Before we actually dive into the new guests, the new interviews, and all the new great stuff that's going to make up Season 2, I felt like it was appropriate to look back through Season 1 and highlight a few of the moments that actually defined what Season 1 was about. Moments that, in all honesty, helped me clarify what this podcast was actually about. That we're learning to navigate the turbulent waters in which the practice and expression of faith finds itself. The past few years has been marked by a series of honest, poignant, and in many cases helpful critiques of religious culture. That the spaces and the places in which we would normally or traditionally have gathered to see ourselves and one another and God more clearly, well, those spaces don't quite work the way they used to or the way they were promised, or they don't work for enough people or enough kinds of people. The At Sea Podcast is not only a way to navigate those turbulent waters, but a way to help shape what it looks like to think spiritually and humanly, to practice faith without the safe harbors we might have once counted on. We're doing that by highlighting great culture makers, because what they do deepens and enriches our lives. These are women and men who are also building into what comes next regarding the expression and practice of faith. Season 1 began in conversation with graphic novelist Jean Yang. We not only covered the importance and uniqueness of comic books, but also dug into the importance and uniqueness of the Asian experience in America and the difficulty that comes with approaching issues of race and religion in art.
You got to speak at an event in the National Book Festival in 2014. You gave a talk about diversity at just this past year, in which you talked about, and I'm going to pull up the image here as soon as I can get my tech to work.
Okay.
About the character Black Panther.
Yeah.
And the sort of the pivotal point that the pivot point that Black Panther as a character is in comics history. Can you give us a little bit of that right now?
Sure. I was talking about Black Panther in the context of the. I was primarily talking about a comic book writer named Dwayne McDuffie, who I admire very much. He is unfortunately no longer with us. He's an African American, one of the most prominent African American writers in American comics. And he wrote this essay where he talked about the Black Panther. The Black Panther is one of the few African American superheroes in the Marvel Universe who has had his own title. So Dwayne McDuffie talked about how when he was a kid, he read this Black Panther story. And because he read that Black Panther story, he got into comics as a career. Black Panther is not a perfect character. He is not a perfect representation of what it means to be a black man. Like first, he has the word black in his name.
In his superhero
name. Yeah, and early African American characters, they always had the word black in their name. It was like their ethnicity mattered more than anything else about their character. And he was created by these two middle-aged Jewish American men. And there's just lots of little funky things about his character. But despite his imperfections, he was still able to inspire this young African-American boy to grow up to become a writer. So the context of that was, of my talk was, I think nowadays talks about ethnicity and race have gotten strangely weird. I feel like when you read the news, it's like we traveled back in time to the 1960s. There are now church bombings and stuff. It's just crazy. It's crazy to me. And I think because of this climate, sometimes writers are afraid to write outside of their own ethnicity. But I also think it's a necessary thing, right? You can't have an entire book where every single character is just a reflection of your own cultural understanding and your own cultural background. So the point of the talk was just to encourage people to have the courage to write outside of their ethnicity.
That conversation with Jean Yang was followed by an evening with the indie pop rock band Jars of Clay, who's lived into a different kind of artistic courage by challenging, and in many ways disappointing, the dominant religious culture they were given to and had given themselves to.
I remember being in school and watching the way that being a Christian or a believer would manifest itself in a school was that the kids were just sort of weird. Like they were
Weird
somewhat
how? Like-
weird like they were holding up this banner saying we're going against the flow, and what that really meant is that they wore their Christian T-shirts and they sat in their own sort of corner and they said we're the Christians, and it was very isolating actually. It wasn't a welcoming kind of environment that I recall as a kid, and I think I grew up somewhat confused, and I couldn't have articulated this then, but it was that whole sense that the youth group culture sometimes wants to sort of give kids all these answers, and say, okay, here it is. This is the Christian life. Here's how we've got it figured out for you. And they give the kids the answers because the church kind of we like our answers. We like to have the agreement about the way life works. But the problem with that is that it's an isolating kind of weight to carry, because you end up planting the flag. And I always saw that growing up, was that if you have the answer, you have a certain amount of options, and one of those is to stay away from anyone that might question that answer and poke a hole in it, because all of a sudden now faith becomes more fragile, and you don't want it to be fragile because that undermines your whole way of life. So you either stay away from those people and you isolate yourself from them, or you attack them back and you become more judgmental and more angry towards them, and you fight for your answer rather than having kind of that welcoming, everybody's welcome at the table place. And I think that's what, whenever I hear, scripture or people in the church use army metaphors to describe faith, I think back to my high school days where I saw the kids going against the flow, which just meant they were awkward and antisocial, kind of their own thing, and they weren't welcoming or involved in a cultural conversation. They were just isolated.
We stuck around the theme of music and connected with Mike Busby, a Los Angeles-based songwriter working with artists from Grammy winners like Pink and Kelly Clarkson, Keith Urban, and Maren Morris, to newcomers like Carly Pearce. We talked about pop music being something far from a watered-down form of art, and something more like a strenuous and highly focused creative expression.
For me personally, the part that feels the best of that is that someone felt something because of something you did.
So that leads me to this, and doesn't that, and I asked this half facetiously, doesn't that actually cheapen the art form then? If it's about, so like it's more natural, I think, to say, like, from the sort of pure artist standpoint, that it's about me and my expression. That it's about my expression, and if you connect with, that's part of what I was going after earlier, like, if you connect with what I'm doing, then great. If you don't, well, then screw you, which now is track 4.
Yeah, exactly.
On RIP. Screw you, audience.
It's too long of a title.
It's too long of a title. But, like, I'm going to do what I'm going to do.
Yeah.
It's in me. I've got to get it out. And if you connect with it, great. But I don't really care.
Yeah.
And that seems like, there's sort of a temptation to believe, like, that's pure art. Whereas if it's about connecting with someone else, if it's about you over there and I'm writing a song with the intention of, like, you having an emotional response, that's cheaper. And isn't, like, that's sort of a cheaper form of art. Isn't that the critique of pop?
Yeah, it is. And it's funny, for better or worse, I haven't given a ton of thought to this because I just sort of, like, we will engage in this conversation. I love this, but I'm so not even in the headspace of, like, well, it's not indie enough or it's not legit enough or whatever. I'm just like,
it doesn't matter to you.
I'm like miles away from that, in the sense of there's nothing more indie rock than being a jazz trombone player. So no one's gonna step to me with their indie rock bullshit and be like, you're not cool enough for indie. I'm like, I played jazz trombone back in the day, and that's how I made a living. Like,
talk about doing art that no one cares
exactly
about. No one cares.
And I had to work through my whole thing. But it's interesting, the thought that comes to mind as you're saying that is, I actually do think, I believe, and this is a bit off the cuff, so don't hold me to this, that art actually is for other people to ingest and to have an experience with. Because I believe, as a creative person, I am reflecting the creator. And the creator did not make his creation in a vacuum. He made his creation, at least the part that we're aware of, for us to interact with. And we as his creation, are to interact back with him. So it's not, I don't think the great creator is just going, well, screw you. I don't care if you like the trees or not. They're my trees. Yeah, whatever. Screw you, you're a great creator. So as a result of that, I do feel that art is supposed to actually
Be about
invoke
other
something.
people.
Yeah, 100%, not 100% about them, but it is 100% supposed to be about other people in some capacity. And often, not always, the people who say those types of things that you're sort of referencing are ones who are bitter about the fact that their art isn't being accepted or whatever the case may be. And to me, when you think about it, it's like they're not mutually exclusive. You can fully express yourself and potentially fully connect with somebody else.
Caitlin Beatty then guided us into an experience of creativity and leadership and religion through the lens of womanhood. With her, we also got into talking about her first job of, at all places, McDonald's. And then the calling, the choice, and the lifestyle of singleness.
Having children becomes not just normal, which it is, but like normative. Like there's something wrong
It
if
becomes
you don't.
kind of standardized.
Yeah, standardized. And so it's easy to feel like a stump, you know, like I'm not doing what all my friends are doing, you know. And so I felt like I did have to include a chapter on singleness in the book, or kind of, a vision of a single life, because I wanted women as well as men to be encouraged to see their work as part of the way they live a fruitful life, whether or not they have children. I think women especially can feel like, professional work is good up to a point, but then like once I have children, I'm going to move into a totally new stage of life. I think we sometimes believe like I'm going to become a new person when this happens, and I'm going to give up the work that I was doing in the past. And I understand like some people just have to do that out of necessity and out of practical constraints. But yeah, I think that can leave women who don't ever have children for whatever reason feeling like, is the work that I'm doing now, does it matter? Like, does it matter in some ultimate sense? And I want to say like, yes, it does.
We return to the topic of race in a powerful conversation with Pastor Michael McBride. It established a kind of new practice with the podcast, the forming of a lexicon, digging into the uses and understandings of even common words through the lens and experience of our guests. In this case, Pastor Mike dissected and expanded on our take of what it might actually mean to be white. And he does so with as good a cultural starting place as I can think of, Dave Chappelle.
Dave Chappelle said, you've made it as a black comedian when white people start coming to your shows and everybody starts laughing. There's some white people in the crowd. He says, oh, I see you white people. Great having you here. But when I do white jokes about white people, most of you think I'm talking about you. But when you make $50 million, they pull you behind the curtain and you get to meet the real white people. He said, the rest of you just think you're white.
That's good.
Now think about this. When you break down the history of racial hierarchy, whiteness is the function of the elite white land-owning male. So if you are not elite, wealthy, white, and male, all of those things together, whiteness has not been created for you. It becomes an idol that everyone is reaching to grasp. There are great books about how Irish became white, how Jews became white, how Italians became white. What I say to folks, particularly my white brothers and sisters, is you need to be set free from whiteness and recover your own cultural heritage. White folks that come to the United States are not created by God to be white. You're created in your culture as Polish, German, Jewish,
Which is
Irish.
which is when folks talk about like whiteness as it's an invention.
It's an invention.
It's not like an intrinsic reality.
No.
It's a systemic invention.
And it is used to assign value and hierarchy among racial difference.
So let's stay here and do our own little kind of like not necessarily like a word association game, but like we've talked about whiteness for a second. So I'm going to throw a couple other phrases or words at you, and I just want to get like your take, whether you call it a definition or if you just need to monologue on it for a second. So we talked about whiteness, racism.
So racism is the belief that a particular person is inferior based off of their perceived racial characteristics coupled with the power to disadvantage that person because of the perceived inferiority.
So there has to be a power element.
Racism is all about power.
It's not
Everybody.
just a matter of like me cognitively
No.
disliking a race of people.
Well,
There's a power element.
Not if you're talking about racism. Now, if you're talking about bias, if you're talking about
racism.
racism.
When we use the word
absolutely.
racism,
When you use the word racism, we have to talk about power because it is really at the end of the day about the ability to use your perceived inferiority as in a racial hierarchy and use power as a way to punish, exclude, lord over, take authority over. That's what racism is, classically
which
defined.
takes me then to, this is like kind of a trick question then, or a trick word. Reverse racism.
Well, reverse racism only works if you have black or if you have if you have black folk who are in position of power that can exclude white people based off of perceived inferiority. Right. Now, of course, one could say that we now have mayors and other elected officials who are rising to these places or positions, but one could also, who has a true knowledge of how political systems work, would realize that even elected officials, white or black, aren't the real people with the power.
Truth.
That there are forces. That's why people take money. That's why people have campaigns and raise billions of dollars. These are the people who are running these campaigns, and these are the people who really have the power. So reverse racism to me is a response to a changing world that has become more brown. And I think folks should really ask themselves really honest questions about what is this really about?
White supremacy.
Well, white supremacy is what I stated earlier. It is the vision of racial hierarchy that is structured in systems that assign value, that assign social location. It is an idol. It is this idea that whiteness, those who can get as close to whiteness, white male, white wealth, white elite, that is the kind of dominant paradigm of the United States of America historically, and many people are being oppressed, including white people, because of white supremacy. Because if you can't reach those kinds of perches, then you are always being assigned a value, whether subconsciously or consciously, knowing that you are not as good or don't have as much value in this present system.
From one Michael to another, author Michael Weir walked us through the doorway of political engagement and challenged the predominant path of partisanship, urging us to think of politics in more human terms.
We have a rising problem of polarization, and a Stanford study came out in 2014 that showed that this isn't just like politicians, that actually polarization has seeped into our communities. And so they actually did a controlled study. I don't know if you've heard about sort of implicit bias tests, where they become more familiar to folks through race, and how one of the types of tests works is images will flash on like a computer screen, and then adjectives that are either positive or negative, and the way that people respond or relate positive adjectives to different races or negative adjectives to different races actually exposes a lot of implicit bias. Well, these political scientists, I believe they were sociologists, did the test with political affiliation and found that the bias was actually more profound in terms of the influence on the individual. Obviously, there are many more opportunities for discrimination or prejudice to take place when we're talking about race, but because you can't tell whether a person's a Republican or Democrat if they come into your store or that kind of thing. But the impact of polarization was extremely profound. And so in the 1960s, if you asked a parent what they would not want their child to marry. The top two answers would be, I wouldn't want my child to marry someone who's a different religion, and I wouldn't want my child to marry someone who's a different race. Now, the top thing that parents don't want their children to marry is a Republican if they're a Democrat, or a Democrat if they're a Republican. And you just have to...
real? That's an actual test?
That's real. That's an actual test. And you just have to...
Is cowboy still on the list? Because I remember there was a time when, like, your mamas don't let your babies to be cowboys. Because there was like a thing. Not on the list.
Well, and you got to think about how hard society must have been for cowboys.
It really says something that we've moved that far past cowboy.
That's right. But the way that affects us in our daily lives is something that's pretty new. It's pretty new for us to associate with people on the basis of their political views. That isn't something that used to take place to the extent it does today.
Songwriter David Bazan shared a bit of what he's learned in 20 years of self-excavation and examination, including a fascinating, and I would suggest, prophetic take on what it means to be and belong to a religious tribe and tradition.
How much better would we do if everybody just realized, like, this isn't meant to harmonize in the way that you believe that it is. It does harmonize, but not like a math problem.
Right.
You know, it harmonizes like a song or a symphony or something much more complex than we're treating it as. You know, and until the Kinnemans and the Lions of the, will lead and say, can't make a claim about heaven and hell. Can't make a claim about universalism, not universalism. We can make a claim about love. We can make a claim about grace. We can make claims about faith. Can't make claims about truth, rightness, wrongness. That's not the role of faith. That's not the role of grace in culture. To be a salve, to be a salve. Could the church be a salve? Could the church, the Jehovah's Witness, everybody thinks they're crazy. They're not. They don't have a horse in the political race. They believe the Bible in a different and I think idolatrous way, but the fruit on their tree is better than evangelical Christianity in terms of unity, in terms of harmony. Everybody thinks they're fucking crazy, and I'm not saying become Jehovah's Witness, but just look at how it could be. Could we be a salve to one another? Could we listen and be challenged in our politics to somebody else's perspective and know that the right answer, the conclusion, crunching the data, that's not the point of this conversation. The point of this conversation is my friend is hurting and he needs to express it. And the way that he's hurting, the way that it comes out is he is saying that Donald Trump is great. And I'm going to listen to him and not argue with him and just hear him because he needs to say all this stuff. And in modernist Christianity, we can't exist. We have to say, yeah, I hear you, but, or like you talk about gay shit or whatever. It's just like, okay, I hear where you're coming from, but I just got to say that, like, love the sin or hate the sin, kind of thing. Like you have to. I'm coming
with my point.
With your point,
and I'm not coming in relationship.
And just being like, and you can say your point too, but not in the sense of like trying to convince. Just like I have hurt in here that I need to get out. And you're my friend, and so that's what we do for each other.
Yeah,
and we sit like monkeys and we pick the stuff off each other. And when I realize that you have a blind spot, then I come close to you and I pick at your blind spot and I say, hey man, you got a blind spot.
Yeah. It's always struck me that whole notion of the teaching of the plank and the speck.
Oh yeah.
That in order to see a speck in someone's eye, you've got to be pretty damn close.
You got to be close.
You have to be really close to someone actually to see that speck, which communicates like in order to do that kind of work, there's an intimacy. Which makes the whole plank part of it really fascinating. Like if you there's a plank in your eye, and that doesn't allow you to have the proximity to make the judgment about someone else's speck.
And to the degree that if it's not just this binary between the small and the very small and the very big, but this sort of continuum, Like, you might be in a situation, this is how it works, where somebody comes to you and they've got like a medium-sized thing in their eye, and they can come close enough to see the speck in your eye, and graciously, not seeing the thing in their eye, they say, hey man, you got a speck in your eye. And you see the thing in their eye,
And you just say,
and you
"Thanks,
don't
man."
go ad hominem, and you go, oh man, I see it. Can you help me with that?
Yeah.
Can you help me get it out? And then you do the weird sort of like cowardly, the lion with the thing in the splinter in their paw thing, where it's just like, it's not once you see it in there, it's not easy to get it out.
Yeah.
But then the whole time you're doing this process with somebody who has whatever, extremely bad breath. I mean, that's not the thing, but like some uncomfortable, they're close and you're repulsed by the thing that's going on with them, but they're bringing you the good, helpful information. And I don't know, we could be a salve.
Jeremy Courtney graciously invited us to take a brief glimpse into what it takes to honestly give oneself to the kind of good work that doesn't just cost time and money, but potentially costs one their entire lives.
Does anger play a role? Do you hate? How do you combat that? And then in terms of the way America hears and responds to the news, I mean, what's been happening in Aleppo over the last few weeks, there's no news coverage. There's no one talking about it. So how does that, not even like, do you get mad, but like how, like, does anger play a role? Does it have a part in your life? Like, how does that work out for you?
Yeah, anger definitely has a place in our life, and I'm not sure that it's an altogether unhealthy place. I think that...
Like that it's not bad for you to be angry.
Yeah, I don't think it's bad for us to be angry about mass slaughter, about the enslavement and systematic rape of our Yazidi women friends, about the kidnapping of young children, about beheading of men, about sectarian conflict and corruption and barrel bombing of civilian populations, and marking people's homes for expropriation or extermination, for airstrikes that wipe out entire communities, for communities that are liberated, and when the liberators come to town and drive ISIS away, the liberators themselves destroy the very town that they were supposed to be freeing. I don't think anger in the face of such suffering and violence and human evil is unwarranted or is a bad thing. I think I grew up in a more dualistic view of the world that basically said good versus evil, happy versus anger, joy versus sadness. And there was always this like language and posture that we do war within ourselves to drive out all the unpleasant things.
And anger among them. Anger always on the side of the wrong.
The wrong, certainly. And what, even though I would say that my tradition would have used a phrase like righteous anger, I don't know that I was ever actually disciplined in thinking about how anger could genuinely have a seat at the table. And I think what I'm learning now through this crisis in particular, so I'm only about 2 years into this lesson, is that I need anger in my life, and I need sadness, and I need suffering, and I need the unpleasant things, because those unpleasant things, they give context for the happiness and the joy and the pleasant things.
And so begins our journey into Season 2. The first episode of Season 2 actually drops this Wednesday, March 15th. You can keep up with the podcast by visiting @cpodcast.com, and now you can become an integral part of this work and this community. Meet me at patreon.com/Justin McRoberts, or just go to patreon.com, that's Patreon, patreon.com, and search my name, Justin McRoberts. Once we've met there, support this podcast in whatever way and whatever level you can. As I mentioned at the top, the @C podcast is not only a way to navigate the turbulent waters we find ourselves in, but to help shape what it looks like to think spiritually, humanly, and actually practice faith in the world as it is, which for many of us means doing so without the safe harbors we might have once counted on. I believe and know that there is a way forward. Let's help shape what that looks like, and let's do that together. Until next time.